Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect. It's been a while that I've said that sentence, I know, and part of the reason is also the reason that there's a big continue button over here. To be honest, I tried recording this scenario at the start of this year and got a couple of attempts in, but just couldn't really build something that I was happy with. Somehow I was just struggling with the theme and the limited amount of land that we have in this scenario. Then I got a new PC and I got addicted to Planet Coaster, so I also didn't record anything in Parkitect for a while. But right now I'm really feeling like playing Parkitect again, and I really want to tackle the scenario at last. Let me just click that real quick. And let's quickly have a look at what this scenario entails. So we have a hotel on a remote island who wants you to develop some amusement attractions on its property to attract more guests. Local authorities will allow you to buy up all the remaining land on the island, but at a high cost. And the scenario wants us to own at least 3,000 tiles of land, which is a pretty unique objective up to this point in the game. And we also need to get a profit from rides for at least $4,000. Now I think the latter is going to be the actual challenge for this map. I'm gonna forget about reaching the non-optional goals by the end of December year 3 because I already know I'm not gonna get there. And yeah, let's quickly take a look at the scenario and see why this thing is so challenging. At least challenging to make a decent park out of that I've been struggling so much. So we start off with this tiny amount of land over here surrounding this, whatever it is, castle, hotel looking building, and we slowly have to develop this and use more and more of the island. And 3,000 tiles is quite a bit, so we're definitely gonna have to expand a lot here. But if I start buying some land, you might be able to tell that stuff is gonna get decently pricey if we buy more tiles, so that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, let's get started. Oh, before I get started though, one more fun fact that I want to tell about this scenario, and that's actually going to come into the gameplay here today. This scenario is based on Wuhu Island from Wii Sports Resort, and also some of the Mario Kart games. And you might have been able to recognize that it has the same kind of layout with this mountain, the castle looking building here, and then the lake-ish area here with the bridge. Everything's very similar, just one thing is missing that Wuhu Island has, which is a town. So the way that I'm gonna try and tackle it this time around is try and recreate Wuhu Island as much as I can. So most of the island is going to be themed very lightly and just going to use rides and stuff like that to fill it all in. But for part of the island, I'm gonna try to build a Victorian-ish town, or at least something that kind of resembles the architecture from Wuhu Island, and I think Mario Kart is the best example to go from. So yeah, that's gonna be my little experiment this time around. Now let's get started. Hey everybody, it's Silverrat from a few weeks later in here, and I am watching back that intro and wondering why I was so low on energy when I was recording that. Don't know what it was, but there was so much vocal fry in my voice. Also, you could hear me breathing, and I realized I'm unable to try and filter that out because I recorded my own audio and the in-game audio to a single audio track. So you guys are gonna have to deal with that, and you're gonna have to deal with realizing that you can hear my breath. I don't know if you guys mind that or if you like listening to Muse. I guess it would be fine anyway, but yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you watch back yourself and kind of cringe at it a little bit, but you know, that's also part of life. Anyway, I should just talk about what I'm supposed to talk about here. I'm starting off with a roller coaster, naturally, because I need something that makes money, and that is really the primary function of this thing here, because there's no way that I'm ever going to be able to do anything with this scenario if I don't at least start off with a single attraction that can single-handedly carry me throughout this entire scenario, because it's going to be quite difficult to build many roller coasters from the get-go, given the kind of layouts that I want to give this island and where I want to start developing, because this island is based on Wuhu Island from Wii Sports Resort and different Nintendo games as well, and there have been many variations of this island throughout the times, but that's what it's based on, and that's the theme that I want to go for this build as well. And to give a bit more detail about some of the attempts I've done before, The first time I tried this scenario is when I built this layout, this roller coaster that you can see me build right now. So it's basically just a recreation, but the first time I tried this scenario, I was going for a vaguely Victorian theme with lots of wooden pavilions and decorated buildings, kind of, I don't know, resembling Parkitect builds. It doesn't really remind me of much else than just Parkitect builds. Just lots of pillars and roofs covering stuff and trying to decorate it as much as possible. It had a kind of cool look, but I didn't really know what to do with that theme. For some reason, it just didn't really work out. But you guys are gonna see some of the remnants from that attempt in later stages in this final and hopefully successful attempt as well. Then the second attempt, I was going for a more rustic, unpainted wooden aesthetic, which was nice, I guess, but very similar to what I've done in Parkitect so far, and it just didn't really feel right to do that on this island. So right now, this third attempt, I'm going to try and go for Wuhu Island, basically, as a theme. I'm gonna try and make this look like a beach resort, tropical vibes kind of place. Slightly inspired by Wuhu Island, but maybe also a little bit of Delfino Plaza, some Second Empire French colonial Mediterranean architecture inspired stuff with Victorian touches. That sounds like a handful and like way too many things at once, but basically something that seems tropical and beachy. And we'll see how we get there, but that's what my new attempt is going to be. Now, one thing that messed up the earlier attempts is that I tried to make the station for this coaster way too big. I used to have the exit and entrance on either sides of the station, and the queue would wind down the hill just like it does right now, but it would take much more space, and it would just be housed in this enormous building, and it looked out of place every time. So on this attempt, I have the exit and the entrance on the same side, and the queue kind of winds around the station building. The station building itself is only half the size, maybe less than half the size of my previous attempts. Maybe I should just stick some pictures up here so you can get an idea of the iterations that this park went through. So yeah, you can probably see some random pictures pop up right now. But yeah, I think it just works out a lot better the way that it's shaping up now. But keeping that coaster layout pretty much exactly the same as my previous tries, I think I ended up slightly adjusting it, yeah, especially right here, because the roof of the station just needed a little bit more space. So I adjusted that a little bit. I think the final hill is a bit different. Everything just happens to be a little bit better, I guess, every time you try and do something again. So yeah, there are some small changes there, but it's mostly all in the station. And this layout just works out really well because it doesn't need too much space. It's very easy to build. It even has that element over the water, which I think is a pretty cool interaction with also the pathways over there. But at the same time, it's a very good money maker. People like to pay about 8 to 9 euros for this thing. And it doesn't have the best capacity. I could technically run longer trains on it, but I think 12-car trains just look very weird on this coaster, especially because it makes the train so long, but the movements that this coaster makes are very sudden and very quick and kind of, I don't know how to say it, but you know, it has a very small scale. So a long train would cause the back of the train to be absolutely whipped over some of the airtime hills, which funnily enough is what happens on this coaster type in real life. I've never had the pleasure to ride one of these things, but Walibi Holland is going to build one in 2024, I believe. So I'm super hyped about that. But yeah, these things are known to have pretty long trains in comparison to how tight their elements are. So you apparently are supposed to get some wicked airtime on these in real life. And I suppose this one in the game right here is no exception. That said, all the ones that are built in real life so far all have a lift hill. And obviously I don't have space to build a lift hill over here. So a launch coaster it is. And I think it also makes sense because it's a little bit more typical for launch coasters to have very short layouts. Obviously, this layout is not much. We basically have all of 5 elements, I guess, if we're generous. To be completely honest, I still forget what an Immelman and a dive loop is. I think at this point a dive loop is when you do a half loop first and then you do the corkscrew, but it could be the other way around. But yeah, we start off with a dive loop slash Immelman into a quick turnaround into another dive loop slash Immelman, except it's the other element this time. People in the comments can definitely educate me on which is which. 10 years of being a coaster enthusiast and I still don't know this stuff. It's just, I don't know. It's like the roller coaster version of left and right, except I do know what left and right is, but you know, plenty of adults don't know what left and right is all the time. Sometimes I just forget what a dive loop is in an Immelman. And after that we have that crazy kind of top hat airtime hill, which is gonna pull some gnarly negative G's, I think, in the back. And then followed by a small bunny hop, a helix over the water, which is going to be our fun interaction over there. I just realized while looking at this and doing my commentary, I really missed an opportunity here to put some water fountains at in the helix and do that Menta thing where the train passes by and the fountains activate and it looks really cool. Definitely gonna have to do that. It's one of those things in Parkitect which I always forget you can do in the game, but it's such a cool effect and you can be really precise with the timing and the placement of those things, which is especially cool. So I should really do something with that. Now we are moving into some other sections of the park and I'm finally going to start building some buildings. So as you can see, I already built my first little building, which is going to be, well, which was, I should say, my little test building to see how this theme is going to work and what kind of pieces I can use for it. Obviously, I've already built the station and that was pretty nice. I'm pretty happy with it, but that's not going to be the architecture that most of this park is going to have. Now, for the architecture of most of this park, I am generally inspired by French architecture, Second Empire / Queen and colonial architecture that you also find in the US, which is most well known, I would say, for being the main street architecture of Disneyland. Very colorful, it has those typical roofs, lots of arcades on the ground floor and nice windows and nice windows, that doesn't say anything, but a combination of classical elements on the windows and the columns and stuff like that. It's a little bit like Haussmann architecture in Paris, I feel, except on a smaller scale, a bit more colorful and a bit more, I don't know, tropical, fun, theme parky. So that's what I'm going for, and if I'm talking about this in very vague terms, it is because I don't have an exact reference for this stuff. Now, I ended up not recording a section here, so I'm sorry about that, guys. I'm not going to re-record that stuff, but it turned out that my hard drive was full, so I was happily building stuff, and then I realized that I hadn't recorded a bunch of things. So now all of a sudden we have these buildings there, and as you can see, it has the sort of mansard type roofs, columns with arcades on the ground floor, which lead to some of the toilets and shop buildings and stuff like that. And then those typical French, I guess Normandy-esque chimneys as well that you always see in those areas, which I haven't done enough of that in Parkitect, but doing this really made me want to try some kind of Normandy theme, or maybe even, I don't know, England. I think it could work very well with those large chimneys that are separated or that are like right between every building in a row of houses. It's so easy to do, but it really has that typical look, and it's very fun to work on. But yeah, that's basically our main city area for now, and I'm going to continue doing buildings like that in the near future. But first, we need to build another pavilion for one of these flat rides. I started off with the pavilion of the carousel, which is a pavilion that I pretty much recreated from my first try of doing this scenario, and it's one of the few buildings which I actually really liked from that try and figured I should keep around and try and reuse. And for the twister / scrambled eggs over here, I was trying to come up with something different to do because, of course, every time I build one of these pavilions for a flat ride, I'm trying to come up with a structure that I haven't done in the game so far, because otherwise everything's just going to look way too similar and you're going to see me building the same buildings in every episode. Plus, it's just a lot more fun to try and come up with new stuff. So this one's kind of all over the place. It was very fun to work on though, because it's kind of off-grid, and many of the pieces are half roof tiles or quarter roof tiles, and the box 3D art shapes, just to be completely free form and try and work with the smallest grid and make something that's a little bit less obviously on the grid. And it results in a building that is completely different from anything I've done so far, but which I'm pretty happy with. It's actually pretty cool, I find. And also that thing is kind of hidden back in the woods, because my very idea for the layout of the park is that around the lake we really have the town developing, and then anything behind the buildings, behind the facades over here, is kind of a little bit more backstagey, a little bit more into the woods. And I want to make this whole island a little bit more wooded. But yeah, the scrambled eggs is the start of that. So it's kind of hidden behind the tree line there. And with those trees, I'm also trying to block the view of the backside of those facades. As for the backsides of those buildings, I'm trying to not make them too much like Disneyland backsides, but like realistic backsides of buildings. Because something that I think is interesting is, obviously, everything at Disney, and likewise many theme parks that build main streets and the like, is super fake. As soon as you look behind the facade, you realize that it's basically just a warehouse building. There's lots of HVAC stuff on the roof. It doesn't look anything like it does from the front, and it's all just fakery. And in real life, this happens to some extent as well. And especially if you look at French architecture, anybody who's ever been in a Haussmann style building in Paris, and Haussmann style buildings are basically the type that were built in the 19th century when Paris was renovated on a huge scale, and these giant boulevards were created through the city, and the typical architecture that we now consider to be Parisian was more or less invented. But if you ever go into one of these buildings and look at the back sides, one of the windows at the back of the building, and look into the inner courtyards of these city blocks, you'll find that the back sides are just so ugly and messy and all over the place. And when I am trying to build my ugly, messy backsides of these buildings here, I was trying to do that real life, ugly, backside, messy stuff, as opposed to the Disney way of doing it. So at the very least, these facades do have more or less full roofs, although there is a little bit of grey flat roof structure in there as well. But if this were Disney, and if you look at Disney's Main Street, you only see so much of the building that you really have to see, and everything else is just simple warehouse stuff. So the fact that some of these roofs even go beyond just the facade is already kind of unrealistic for being a Disney-inspired theme park building, basically. So yeah, that was my my little rant about backstage. All I'm saying is, I understand wanting to build your backstage areas to be as ugly as possible if you're building a theme park, but sometimes it isn't quite, to that extent. And in real life, there's also a certain sense of facadism, because in real life you also don't have to make the backside of your building as nice looking as the front side. Which reminds me, also, having lived in Brussels, the backsides of buildings in Brussels and other Belgian cities to some extent as well are especially ugly compared to some of the fronts, but also especially interesting, because you can find all of these illegally created buildings that are just glued to the backsides of the nice looking fronts. It's really like that Simpsons meme where Homer is looking very proudly, and you can see his backside is whatever it is in that meme. Honestly, I have no idea. But now we get to a part where I didn't forget, or where I could record, because I finally realized that I had to delete some files. So here's a bit of how I built some of these buildings, and the typical building is pretty straightforward. We have a ground floor with an arcade and some arches, lots of decorations of different pillars and stuff. Then we have the second floor, or the first floor, I think, depending on whether you're an American or a Brit, but you know what I'm talking about, where usually I like to switch to a different color as well. So the ground floor might be a little bit more of a darker color and have some granite textures or more stone textures, and then once we get to the floor above it, We get some stucco walls or sandstone walls, and a simple set of windows, maybe some flower boxes and some awnings. And then on top of that we have a mansard roof, which is that roof that starts out steep and then gets gradually less steep, with some dormers in it, which is typical Haussmann inspired, but also a little bit Second Empire, I feel. So that's the building over there with the red roof, and it's basically following the same kind of template that some of the other buildings in this row are following. I also built that flat ride. I originally was thinking of building a pier there, but then I realized when I built the pier out into the sea, it didn't really make any sense to have a pier that's only about 20 centimeters above sea level. So I decided to just make it look like that flat ride was built out on the beach, and we just have this plateau extending from the beach to put that flat ride there. But my dreams of building a pier at some point, I don't know if they're still gonna happen. Definitely not over here, because I realized it just didn't really work out with the layout of this whole space. Also, we have a section here where the walkway starts to be raised up a little bit, and we get to this higher section, so we can look down on the beach. I figured that would look a little bit better. Plus, we end up getting some height difference within the park, which is always interesting. It's always nice to have stuff kind of going over each other and having different levels. Just makes stuff look nicer. So I don't know if I would give that as a general tip when doing scenery, but it basically always holds true. Same goes for the front of this building. I somehow wanted this building to function as a way to get the pathway from the twister to come back to the boulevard over here. Plus, this gives the building an actual function, because I didn't want to just have a row of empty facades. But there is a little bit of height difference I have to make up over there as well. But I think it actually just kind of works out in my favor, because we get this interesting part of the building that juts out and has some staircases coming out of it. And yeah, I think it makes for an interesting loop around this area here. The only thing that I'm struggling with so far, and I still haven't really found a good solution to, is the fact that the rest of this area doesn't really lend itself very well for another flat ride or roller coaster to be built. It's just not quite enough space to do anything substantial with it. But it's at the same time, it's an occasion where I do want to do something with it, because otherwise it's just going to be pathways leading to nothing. But you know, I'm still going to figure out what I'm going to do with it, because in the end, it's not really a nothing space either, because I guess there are some nice buildings over here, and it does lead to the beach, which, you know, even though people in Parkitect are not going to be able to do anything with the beach, in my own mind, this is still where, I don't know, people could hang out or something. Like, the very theme of this is to be a beach resort town. So obviously the whole architecture and layout of this place should try to follow that as much as possible. So hence also why I am putting all of these fancy facades directly facing the beach. I might be pointing out the obvious here, but it's just a typical layout for a beach resort town, to have beautiful walkways along the beach with fancy architecture. And as soon as you go anywhere beyond that, you start getting into Homer's back, basically. And finally, for this row of houses, I decided it's time for a corner building. I love corner buildings. They're just so much fun, and they're always it's always nice when the corner building is just that little bit more fancy than the other buildings. You can't have too many corner buildings, obviously, but when you do, every now and then, you have to put a spire on that thing, or a little dome, some extra decorations, and it's always fun. So this one, I'm giving this one a dark blue roof, because I figured I didn't really have enough blue of this shade yet. I'm trying to keep all of the buildings very colorful, and this I took from Wuhu Island, because Wuhu Island has all of these colored roofs, especially a lot of blue and orange, so I'm definitely copying that a little bit, so that when you zoom out from this map and squint your eyes a little bit, it does kind of resemble Wuhu Island, or at least I could tell people, you know, that's inspired by Wuhu Island, and people could be like, ah, yeah, I kind of see it. At least I hope that's the case. But yeah, that's our little corner building over here. didn't really know exactly what to do with this in terms of shape, but now that I'm looking back at this thing, I'm actually quite happy with the textures. Most of the walls are from the adventure set, the South American temple pieces basically, and then we have a spire with an extra little blue pointy bit up top, which is something I haven't tried with this roof spire piece, but I think it works very well actually. And the same goes for that little fence that goes alongside the roof. It's a little touch, but it just helps make the building feel that little bit more late 90th century, which also reminds me that in the late 90th century there were a lot of beach towns with this kind of architecture in Europe. Something that comes to my mind is Ostende in Belgium, which used to have a lot of this kind of Victorian architecture, and most of it is now gone in favor of giant concrete skyscrapers. That's not relevant to the video at all, but sometimes I do find it very inspirational to look back at old pictures of Ostende. I also don't want to turn this into hate speech about Ostende, because that city gets way more than enough hate. It's actually a pretty fun city, it's got a nice beach, and it's well worth the visit if you're ever around Belgium for an extended period of time and you're thinking of going to the beach. It's pretty cool. So honestly, I'd recommend it. Speaking of the beach, I figured I couldn't leave this beach uninhabited. Well, unbeached on. Like someone. It has to look like people can actually go to the beach on this beach, if you know what I mean. So I decided to put some parasols in here and make some. Well, I'm still trying to come up with these things, but you know what they are exactly. But they are the kind of thing that you can lie down on the beach on. So yeah, that's what the 3D art pieces are pretty useful for. And with that said, I think I've been doing this time-lapse for long enough. It's time to take a quick look into the game and see how the park's doing, I think. Alright, so here we are. Our beach town is taking shape, and it looks like the park is healthy financially, so that's pretty good. We can actually continue this scenario. It's interesting how normally I feel these scenarios because I end up in money troubles, but at least that's not the issue this time around. So here's my facade of buildings that I didn't record. It's not too interesting, honestly. I don't think you guys missed out on too much, but overall I'm pretty happy with how the boulevard ends up looking, and especially on the back side as well. I was a little bit nervous on how this should work, given that building buildings like these really tends to create some backsides, and I had to figure out how to sufficiently hide them in a sense that wasn't too Disney-like or too much like there's one big planned block of buildings, because I figured it wouldn't really look right with the layout of this park. But I'm pretty happy with this, especially how some of the trees end up hiding it, and we have the sort of hidden scrambled eggs over here. I still need to figure out what I'm going to do with this corner, but I'm pretty happy with the corner building itself, so even this, I think, is going to be a good blueprint for the other side. My plan is to have more buildings over here, maybe even a whole city block, and really make this feel like there's a town. And then the rest of the park map can be much more sparse and have some roller coasters here and there. And for that reason, I might want to develop into this area before I start working on the town here. Because truth be told, the town area is not going to be too profit making, because there's just not that much in terms of roller coasters that you can build through a town like that. I think it would be really cool, but I think it's just not really going to work with the scenery, so I'm gonna try and build my roller coasters and stuff like that over here, give this more of a foresty, woodsy vibe, and maybe see if we can get some interaction between like a mine train and a log flume or stuff like that. And then we'll get to all the shops and flat rides in the city area over here. And basically this is going to be Wuhu City, I guess. I don't know if the city actually has a name, but in the real Wuhu Island, this is right about where the city would be. But then again, the lighthouse would be over here, and maybe if this was Wii Sports, we'd have some stadiums here and there. I'm taking a lot of the creative liberties with that one, but it's still a general inspiration. I just realized I need to do a quick POV of this coaster, because I feel like I'm obliged to give you guys that. So let's go ahead and see what this thing rides like. It's a little bit too short. and I was thinking of maybe extending this coaster once I have more money and I don't need to worry too much about the layout. But also, I don't know, I think it's fine like this, especially for a launch coaster. So we start off with that Immelman dive loop kind of thing. Still not entirely sure. I think this transition actually works out fairly well, given that I changed it a little bit later to fit the station roof under it. And then down to the water where we build up some nice speed and maybe even hit the top speed of the ride, I'm not sure. And back into the station with quite a bit of speed, but you know, with coasters like these, I'm pretty sure the electromagnetic brakes can recharge the launching system or something along those lines. Shouldn't be too much of an issue. But yeah, it's pretty cheap. I think it looks alright, and it manages to make a decent amount of money, although seemingly less so lately. Not sure why that is. Also, this thing is not that intense, but oh, it's okay. Sure, I'll lower the price a little bit. I've noticed that I started off with $10 for this ride, then I turned it into 9, then it became 8, and now that this thing's 8 years old, I guess people don't want to pay for it anymore. So yeah, it's time to build some new roller coasters. We've had this thing for too long. It's really time to expand, so we'll see what I can do over here. Maybe even an alpine coaster. I rarely did one of these things, and also I don't think I've built a single steeplechase in any scenario yet, so I'm gonna try and think of a way that I can incorporate one of those as well, but honestly, I have no idea either. I just press record and see what happens. So without further ado, let's do that. Alright, now this is the point in recording and editing where I realize that this is going to be the longest video in the history of my channel, so that's quite something. I have to say, the way that I make these videos is usually I record a real-time section, then I record a time-lapse, then I record the commentary for that, then I go back into the real-time section, and then I start doing another time-lapse with commentary. Hence why, especially with how long these videos take, all of the different audio takes that you'll find of me throughout this video are multiple weeks apart. So I'm a whole different person at this point, yet again, from the Silverette that you just heard a few seconds ago. So that's fun, I guess. And I think it's not completely unusual for YouTube videos to be made like that, but with this episode in particular, it's gonna be a bit of a challenge to see how well I can stick to the format, because truth be told, I like to think I'm pretty good at talking without actually saying anything, and trying to keep talking while getting little to no input of what to talk about. And I like to go on long rambles and tangents and stuff like that. But I am sitting here in front of my editing software looking at an hour of time-lapse footage thinking, this isn't even all of the time-lapse that I've recorded, and I already forgot to record some parts, and there are some parts where my hard drive was full and I had to wipe some other stuff to make space for this extremely large episode, and I'm still thinking, God, this is just too much. I'm not sure how I'm going to keep this up. But that's enough meta commentary for now. I'm gonna try to not start off every time-lapse with a bunch of meta insight that you guys may or may not be wanting to get. I'm starting off this part of the park with a large boulevard next to the water, and the idea for this section is that this is going to be really the main section of the town. So I'm going to put most of the buildings here, lots of flat rides, a very carnival beach town-esque vibe in general, and mostly the theming and the pathway structures and stuff like that I'm going to keep around from the rest of the map, which, to be honest, is something that you might have noticed is something that I like to do in general. Usually my first couple of buildings, but also my first couple of paths and all of the scenery around it, the tree selection and stuff like that as well. All of that at the beginning of a scenario is kind of my trial run to see how everything vibes together and to get my color palette and textures and different things and pieces that I'm using. And then once I get into the later section of making the scenario, I just copy those colors and items throughout the map to try and get a cohesive look throughout the entire map, and that's basically what I'm doing here as well, taking some of the same path textures and ways that I've made the beach boulevard on the other side of the water and kind of transplanting them over here. Some fun little tidbits that are interesting to talk about, I think, are the use of the pavilions over the queue line over here. It's something that I don't remember where I saw this, but somewhere on the Parkitect Discord, which by the way, is a really great source to look for inspiration and fellow Parkitect players. But somewhere over there, I found this interesting technique of putting different pavilions inside of each other, the one with the shade sail basically, and rotating them 180 degrees, and it creates this interesting checkered pattern of rectangles. And it's really fun and really easy to do, and it's something that I don't think I've ever used before, and I haven't really seen many people use it. But it's a really nice trick to create some diversity over there as well. So I decided to give it a go with these planes over here. As for the planes themselves, generally I feel like there are flat rides that you can put in buildings and put a roof over, and there are flat rides where you can't really do that. These planes, I think, are kind of in a middle ground, where the middle section is a little bit too tall, but it's still doable to put it inside a building. But then that defeats the whole purpose of having planes. It wouldn't really fit the theme to put this thing inside a building, and rather, I feel like you would want to have some open space. So either put those somewhere on a hill or next to the water or something like that. The latter is what I ended up going for in this scenario. So yeah, I'm going to be pretty careful with where I place which flat rides, which is voice crack. Also something that is, I don't know, a little bit different from my usual approach, because usually I like to build lots of roller coasters and flat rides are just kind of the filler. But in this park, I feel like flat rides actually take center stage to the whole layout and the theme of the park. And I think it's just because flat rides work a lot better in the beach boulevard setting, and don't destroy the urban fabric of the town that I'm trying to create here. And trying to mesh roller coasters together with lots of buildings is something that's decently doable, and it's a lot of fun to do. But then you get to Phantasialand levels of theming, which I think is going to be pretty hard to pull off in a scenario setting. Plus, for flat rides, you don't need that much space. So with flat rides, I was able to start expanding the park little by little and adding extra rides, which also adds more guests and more profits, which makes it a little bit easier to expand a bit more. And roller coasters, once you get to the point where your roller coasters end up becoming quite large and have a decent footprint and become pretty expensive, I felt like they were too big an investment to make at this stage, and I would rather try to expand the park a little bit, bit by bit, and try to increase my profits that way, up to the point where I have enough flat rides that I can actually make a decent bit of money from all of these flat rides. Plus the extra guests that it draws in increases the profit of the one roller coaster that I do have, and by that time I can hopefully expand the park in large sections that are actually big enough and have given me enough budget to build some big proper roller coasters. At least that's the plan. Plus, I wanted to start off with theming the water side over here and making these boulevards before I did anything else, because I felt like they are the most important part of what I wanted to pull off here, and I can always move to the back sections uphill at some later stage and add some of the roller coasters over there. So over here we have a toppling tower, I believe these things are called. It's a flat ride that I don't get to use very often in scenarios, and I think part of the reason is that it has such an enormous footprint and it's just kind of awkward to get into certain locations. But looking at this island, I was thinking for a while of what to place in here, and once I tried putting this thing over here, I realized that it's pretty much the perfect setting. Just like the planes, you really want an open space, I feel like, for these things. You want to put it on make it a centerpiece, part of the theming and part of the scenery, and really showcase that ride, especially because it's so wacky and so weird. So I felt like this island was actually the perfect place to put this thing. I think it's called a topple tower, not a toppling tower. But yeah, fun facts about these things in real life. I believe there are only 2 of them ever built, at least the 2 that I know of. One in Bellewaerde in Belgium, which is still standing today, and one in Djursommerland in Denmark, which has been demolished. And I've had the pleasure, or displeasure, of riding the one in Denmark, and I have to say, they are pretty fun. I think it's a very creative idea for a flat ride. That said, if you're of the male sex, and you have your male genitals, and you're a little bit on the taller side, it can definitely be slightly uncomfortable. Not horribly so, but definitely to the extent where you're like, I'm not entirely sure how much I like this, but I really like the idea of these things. They look really fun off-ride, they're just really fun to look at, and the theming of the whole thing is pretty cool as well. This one doesn't really have any theming, but the one in Bellewaerde, I believe, as well, also has that bird's head on top of it, and it just looks so weird. Bopping up and down, and I think the fun part of it as well is the fact that it does a completely opposite movement from what most flat rides do in theme parks. Most flat rides just spin in some sense, and some flat rides swing, and then again some flat rides also spin and swing at the same time. These are generally the movements that 99% of flat rides do, and once you sort of get that theme into your head, it's something that you can't unsee as well, because the variety of flat rides is really not that big. They just all find different ways to spin and swing. And this thing does a completely different motion than any other flat ride, and I think that's something that I respect it for. It's a creative idea, the engineering behind it is super impressive. The ride experience is fun because it's unique, but these were never going to conquer the world. So I think it makes sense that these things were never a huge success on the flat ride market. That said, it's really fun, and it's not really fun, but it is fun for what it is, for the novelty that it is. And if you ever find yourself with the opportunity to visit Bellewaerde in Belgium, you should definitely give this thing a try. Because they might very well be extinct at some point in the future. And that would be kind of a shame. And at least it's good that these things are forever in Parkitect. We'll never forget about these things. Unless it's me forgetting the name of these things and calling them a toppling tower. But, what does that matter anyway? Now, over here on the left, I decided to put my next flat ride, which is the spiral slide, which has that typical helter-skelter old school look. And fun fact, this is not based on the Roller Coaster Tycoon spiral slide. Both of these spiral slides are based on the traditional helter-skelter slides that you find very often in British fairgrounds and theme parks, I believe. And it's just a classic look, and I feel like the look of the building itself is really even more special than the slide itself, because the slide is just a spiral slide. We've all been on slides. It's nothing special, but the architecture of the building, I think, is really nice, really charming, and what makes these things so distinct. Also, it looks a little bit like a lighthouse, but of course this map already has a lighthouse, so there was no use theming this thing to be a lighthouse. But I could very well see using basic shapes in the game to turn one of these spiral slides into a custom lighthouse. I think that would be pretty fun to try. Anyway, at this point I figured it was time for a roller coaster, but I didn't quite have the space nor the money to build a big old roller coaster, so I wanted to go for something that I believe I've never done in a scenario before, and which, to my knowledge, I think I've actually never built in Parkitect before, which is, one of these aero horse riding coasters, and something that I found very cool, but at the same time kind of annoying about these things in Parkitect is that they are very accurate. They are very much based on their real-life counterpart, one of which is still running in Blackpool Pleasure Beach in England, and I believe it's also the only one still operating, which is Steeplechase. At some point there was a similar version of that ride in Knott's Berry Farm, I believe it was, but I'm not entirely sure, which was the Derby Racers, I believe it's called, which is also what the Soapbox Derby Racer ride in Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 was based on. We are just restricted to horse vehicles on the coaster in the game, but yeah, it's this single rail coaster which doesn't really hit any high speeds whatsoever, but I do believe this is probably very thrilling in the sense that you are very vulnerable because you're sitting on top of a horse and the ground is quite a few meters below you at that point, and you're still making a decent bit of speed. So I've never ridden one of these things, so it's very difficult for me to figure out what the ride experience would be like, but there's one in Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Actually, I think it's 3 or 4 tracks that are dueling. And also because these things typically duel, because they're very much themed to doing that kind of thing, I first started off with a single layout, but then I figured, nah, it just doesn't work for this kind of coaster. We really need 2 tracks. Plus, that means we have 2 coasters in our attraction lineup, which hopefully means a few more guests and a little bit more income. And it's also more fun to look at these things, kind of dueling. I didn't do the dueling thing entirely correctly because the blue track loses most of the time. Not always. If the red track is empty, the blue track usually wins. But red has a slight advantage. That's just how it is. It was very difficult to work with the space that we're given here. And we also don't have any brakes or any other special elements on this coaster in Parkitect. And the reason that I said it's almost kind of too realistic, to the degree that it's a little bit annoying, is that you really can't add any big drops to these coasters. The lift hill can barely be a few meters tall before it starts screaming that it's too high for supports. And yeah, these things just make it difficult to make any kind of fun layout with these things. Plus, I still had to figure out where to put the queue lines and the exits and have the pathways go around this area as well, while at the same time having a decent enough layout where the horse carriages can both kind of do their dueling thing. So it was not actually as easy to figure out this layout as I thought it would be. There's also the thing that you don't want the curves to be taken at too high of a speed because it would be uncomfortable. You can only bank these corners 20 degrees. So we just have some curves, then a dip, and then a little hill again, and then another curve at a lower speed, and then some dips. And that's basically it, all the way down to the station, with a little bit of space to also have some pathways around this area. But yeah, it's pretty fun to look at. Also, at this point, the footage is standing still for a while, because I was getting a call at that point. But yeah, we're gonna continue. Fun fact, that was definitely a 5-minute call, but looking back on time lapses, it's sped up about 12 times, so everything whizzes by. Then there's the challenge of building a station for these things, especially because the blue track is coming dangerously close to where I was planning to put the station building. I also went through a couple of roof designs, as you can see, before I decided to go for this hipped roof over here, as you can see. Not really the best ever station building, but I really wanted to figure out a way to make this work with the layout of these coasters, and yeah, I think it works out in the end. Plus, I wanted to use certain cornices that I could put lights on, which I feel I haven't really talked about enough yet, but I really wanted to light up the park everywhere, so I put all of these little light bulbs in typical Victorian fashion, as you often see with these kinds of buildings everywhere, which is honestly pretty easy. Generally what I did is to take the spherical light, the one that's pretty big, but make it very small, and yeah, just put it everywhere on the 4th grid option. So Alt 4 gives you that grid that's 4 times smaller than the standard grid of the game, and then I just added those things everywhere. And now it's time for a flat ride inside a building, but in a different way than I normally do these things. So we're going for the classic teacups. This is one of those flat rides that you generally always want to put a roof over. It just works too well for that kind of thing. Plus, from a gameplay perspective and a real life perspective as well, it's always good to have flat rides that are covered for rainy days. And that goes for rides that are covered in general, but flat rides as well, which is also very fun to put inside. I was visiting Europa Park 2 weeks ago, and Europa Park has this ride called Columbusjolen, which is a typical carousel that is usually reserved for kiddie areas. Not a carousel with horses, but the one with boats that kind of go up and down. But this one is so good, and I don't want to spoil what it does, just in case any of you guys ever visit Europa Park. All I want to say is do ride Columbusjolen. It's all the way in the back in the Spain area. It doesn't look that special. It's next to a kiddie's playground and some other very much children-oriented flat rides. And in fact, this flat ride is not very big. It's not super intense. It's really a kid's ride, but it's just so good because it's inside a building and the theming is amazing and it really puts on a show. So all that to say, flat rides can be really great if you put them indoors, and especially if you combine it with some theming as well. I feel like flat rides in general in real life theme parks, but also in theme park games, are too often just reserved for filler to put in different areas. Filler both in an aesthetic sense, in that they can fill out an area, and in a day-filling sense, that flat rides are always fun to do in between coasters and in between rides that have very long queues. But yeah, themed flat rides and indoor flat rides are the way to go. Very underrated, and I think Europa Park is one of the best ones with Columbus Jolen. So definitely give that one a try if you're ever in the area. And if there are any other fellow Columbus Jolen fans out there, I'd love to hear the support. For me, it was one of the rides that really positively surprised me also because I went in with zero expectations. I was just dragged in there by my traveling company who was like, you have to see this. And I was like, what is this going to be? I was super skeptical, but it kind of blew me away. But yeah, that's that. So put your flat rides indoors is generally what I'd say. But I've been getting very off topic. We're talking about teacups here, and the reason that I wanted to try this thing a little bit differently is I knew I wanted to build some big facades over here, some big French beach, tropical, colorful facades over here, and I wanted this whole area to look like a city basically. But I wasn't really sure what to do with those buildings. I couldn't just put food courts and toilets in every building, but also these kinds of buildings aren't the most interesting for flat rides. So eventually I came up with this idea. The outside of the city block is basically generic city block buildings and the same style as the buildings on the other side of the water over here. And then on the inside we have this glass canopy that covers the flat ride, and where you can see the back sides of some of the buildings as well, and some of the chimneys sticking out and stuff like that. A little bit of the messy side and the less decorated side of these buildings, as they typically tend to be in real life too. And yeah, it allows natural light to come into that flat ride, makes it feel like you're really in the city, but at the same time allows me to give these buildings an actual function and not just let them be scenery, because I'm trying very hard to not build buildings that don't have functions anymore. It's something that I used to do a lot in theme park games for many years, just because I like buildings, and I like building buildings first before coming up with what they actually should be doing there. But I think this is actually a pretty fun way to theme a flat ride like this. Plus, if this were just covered with a standard pavilion, I felt like at that point we would be seeing way too many of those typical, obvious flat ride pavilion roof structures, and it would just get a little bit boring and repetitive at some point. Speaking of which, I am still trying to keep the themes of these buildings on the side very repetitive, and taking a lot of the colors and the building elements from other buildings. So what I also noticed is that I was getting much faster at building these buildings than I was at the beginning, because at this point I'm not trying to figure out anymore what kind of pieces I'm going to use and what colors I'm going to select, and everything's already obvious before you start building a building, which in this case was pillars first, and then the connections between those pillars with art pieces, some arches or simple walls at the ground floor, and then decorated windows that either go into the building or stick out of the building with different pieces, and a steep roof with lots of dormers and those typical chimneys on the sides. And then the way that you do all of these details, the specific pillar pieces that you use, the colors, the details, everything, you try to vary those between the buildings, but the same style is generally apparent everywhere. So we have 2 floors and then a roof, a mansard roof with dormers of different styles, and we have one color for basically all of the walls, which is sandstone for all of these buildings, one color for the roof, and one color for the details, like mostly all of the awnings on these buildings. Which comes back to a very common trick for theming like this, which is that every building should have 3 main colors, one for the walls, one for the accents, and one for the roof. And You can vary a lot within those themes. You can basically choose whatever colors you want and you think work out, but as long as you stick to those rules, generally all of your buildings are going to look fine. And obviously you can break these rules, because rules are always meant to be broken, and breaking the rules is sometimes also what makes things fun and interesting and engaging. But these rules are a really good guideline to get good color schemes in general. And then there are also some other rules that you can apply to this, like the fact that walls should typically be very mellow, rustic colors, not too eye-popping, not too bright or saturated. And then accents can be the most saturated colors, and roofs are somewhere in between, and typically also a little bit darker than the walls. But those are some extra tips and tidbits. But the 3-color rule is something that is very good and easy to follow, and something that you can very often see applied to real-life theme parks as well. Very obviously on Main Street USA in Disneyland or Disney World. You can really see the walls, the accents, and the roof colors on many of the buildings. Anyway, moving on. The next thing that I wanted to build over here is kind of a centerpiece for this street. It's the train station. And yes, I am going to build a train, and it's going to go all throughout this island, and it's going to connect this side to the other side. Partly just because I wanted to do something like that. It just felt like the natural kind of thing to do since we have such a large island, and also because I think it just adds a fun layer of complexity to the whole park. If you have a train that goes over and under some of the rides and pathways, everything's just a little bit more interesting once you have different things crossing each other, which is why Terran in Phantasialand is so good. Okay, I need to stop randomly associative thinking the rambles, but yeah, that's something that always works out. You know, try to not make your parks too flat. Try to have lots of different things interacting with each other on different layers. Yada yada yada. That is basically what results in an interesting park to look at. Now, for the roof of this building, I used some of those Mansard roof pieces again, and I realized that because of the shape of this roof, I had some weird little pieces sticking out, and decided to use that as a strength instead of a weakness, and just added lots of different roof pieces in the middle of the roof, where you don't see most of the roof piece, but you do see the bits that stick out above the gray roof tiles or roof pieces on the roof there. But that's a stupid sentence, but you know what I mean. So we get that sort of grid pattern of different golden sections over there, which I think actually kind of works. It gives this whole building an almost steampunky steel vibe, but I believe that fits with the train station. Given the fact that this is kind of typical train station architecture, in a Just World, I would have loved to give this thing some curved glass hallway look that some train stations in real life do have. But given that this is Parkitect and we don't have the curved glass pieces that I was hoping for, alas, it's something that is never going to happen. But I think this is a good second option as well. Plus we have a dome in the middle, which is that kind of centerpiece element that you can see in the distance as you're walking through that boulevard with the buildings on the sides. So I think it's a good way to, basically finish that whole city area. And don't worry about that block in the middle. It's going to be filled in at some point in the future as well. But for now, I first wanted to figure out some more of the layout of this whole area, which generally I feel much more comfortable doing some of the scenery once I've already figured out the layout of an area. It's kind of spooky and scary to work out details in scenery before you know how everything's going to be laid out exactly. So you'll often find me, especially in this scenario, I think, because this was a very difficult map to work with layout-wise, you'll often find me just working out a general direction of where to go and plopping down some flat rides and paths before I move back to older areas and try to retheme those things. Now for this part, I'm trying to lay it out in such a way that I can make use of the terrain differences instead of having it become a weakness of this whole area. And I think there are some interesting ways to do that. For one, we have the train station that also kind of hides a staircase behind it. And I think what's fun about it is the fact that the train station is elevated from the perspective of the main street, which is pretty typical if you compare it to many train stations in theme parks like the entrance of Europa Park or of Disneyland in Hong Kong, but also I think Disney World also has that one. So we have that elevated train station look, but because it's on the hillside, the train rails themselves actually stay on the ground the whole time, which is what I'm trying to do with the train line in general. You know, I don't want to build many big bridges and stuff like that. I'm going to try to work it into the terrain so that the rails are on the ground the whole time. And then behind the train station building, we have the staircase that leads up the hillside. So it's an interesting kind of way to hide how that works, but still have that elevated train station look from the main street. And then over here, the stone plateau that I was preparing there is going to house a chair swing, which hopefully, given the fact that it's on this stone plateau that's kind of jutting out and has this view over the rest of the city, I say city, but you know, it's basically a very small fake town that I'm trying to make look as much like a large town as possible. But yeah, you'll have some views over there, and hopefully that location of the flat ride is going to work out in my favor as well. And then there's, of course, some of the detailing. I wasn't really sure how to detail these horse coasters exactly, so I just put some gardening around it. I think it fits in with the area around the Helter Skelter too, but it's nothing very remarkable or super themed, which also, given the theme of this park, I don't think the coasters really need that. I feel like the beach resort theme is actually kind of a meta theme that works for theme parks very well, because the fact that it's a theme park is kind of part of the theme itself, which is always one of the most clever themes, I feel like, but at the same time one of the lamest. I know, thanks to comments on my video where I was critiquing Velocicoaster, that Velocicoaster is themed to being a roller coaster. Velocicoaster is a roller coaster in Universal Studios in Orlando, and the theming of that coaster is that it is a coaster going through the Velociraptor enclosures, which is a pretty cool theme because it doesn't really get more immersive than actually being on a roller coaster. So, you know, props to them for coming up with that idea. Stupid of me of not realizing it before I was recording my video. But in my defense, as much as I do have many theme park facts and experiences in my head, I do these recordings with very little preparation and mostly just ramble whatever comes out at the top of my head, which isn't always accurate. So definitely do double check me, and if you watch my videos, please do check the comments, because people are very vigilant at correcting me, which I am very thankful for, because a stream of consciousness will never be completely correct. And I think this goes for streamers and podcasts especially, which are sometimes justly corrected on different facts and critiqued for not being entirely true, but I think it's something that's also part of the nature of just recording free-flowing conversations and monologues, which is very different from scripted content, I think, which should definitely strive to be more accurate than just a free-flowing stream of consciousness content. And I am not going to do scripted content because honestly it's already enough effort to try and record videos like this at a somewhat reasonable pace of uploads, the way that I'm doing it right now. Also, I have no idea how I would sound scripted. I feel like it would be very different. I feel like at least you do get a little bit of my personality coming through a little bit more in my commentary, even though obviously at any point of the day and in our lives we all have our masks that we put on, and especially as a content creator, there's a certain way that you talk and do things that isn't exactly the way that you would in a real life setting. But yeah, it feels a little bit more personal, I guess. Anyway, moving on. We still have a lot of time-lapse to go. We still have a lot of work to do for this scenario. The next thing that I wanted to do is build a big fancy building. And I wasn't really sure why I wanted to build a big fancy building, but I just knew I really wanted to do it. And this was going to be my attempt at doing that. Generally, when you get to big fancy buildings in a classical or neoclassical style, that's just where you bring out the extra details. So instead of just one pillar, you have double pillars everywhere, double columns with more detail and larger cornices and everything. So that's what this building is about. We have double pillars and awnings and window boxes and all the windows. The windows are larger than some of the other buildings' windows. We have that big old front door, and it's just all around a good experience. It's a lot taller than the other buildings as well, because I needed all of that extra height to make these cornices using the basic arch shapes. But yeah, this might be, I don't know, some big office or bank or something like that. Something that I am still procrastinating on in this scenario, but do want to do at some point, is putting signs on some of these buildings. And maybe it's not the most maybe it's not the smartest decision to do that after I've already built all of these buildings. But yeah, it is something that I am very well aware of. I think this would look a little bit better if there was a sign up front that said hotel or bank or whatever. Maybe it's even a Grand Hotel. I think it could very well be the Grand Hotel. But it's just something that I like adding in hindsight, which I think for something like that also doesn't matter too much, because generally these buildings were not designed by their architects with all of the signage and advertisements that were later placed on them in mind. So if they look tacked on later, I think that's also just going to serve the theme that much better. Plus, I feel like you can always change the ground floor of a building to your liking at a later stage, which is something that happens very frequently in real life as well, especially if you go to cities that are very well known for their architecture, like Paris, but basically any European city. You'll notice that some of the ground floors are very different from the top floors, and many restaurants and shops change them to their liking. Which also, to be honest, isn't always to my liking. I think it's always best when a building has a plinth that mostly fits what the rest of the building style is. And very typically with large commercial stores and McDonald's and stuff like that, you'll find that they are inside an old building, which they have to protect because it's a monument or whatever, but the ground floor is ruined by lots of changes. But, you know, that's an opinion. And everybody can have their own opinion. But there is this interesting project that many municipalities do in the Netherlands. I don't know about other countries, but I know this is a thing in many cities over here, where they grant subsidies for restoring the ground floors of shop buildings to their original state, or to fit in more with the traditional look of the rest of the building, which I think is a very cool project. And I don't know how I ended up on this whole tangent. But yeah, the crux of the story is I'm going to get to signage and stuff like that at a later stage, but I think it can safely be tacked onto these buildings without too much of a worry. For now, I just wanted to focus on fixing the big picture, and then later on seeing if any buildings need a little sign or a cafe name or something along those lines. And before I do that, I should definitely get some inspiration for what to call those things, because right now, off the top of my head, I can't really come up with any fun names, but there really have to be some good examples. Now, of course, this park is inspired by Wuhu Island, but I have no idea about the language that they speak on that island. Might just be English. It might just be wait, do Mii's have their own language? Did Nintendo come up with a language for them? It doesn't matter. For now, I'm going for mostly a French colonial architecture vibe, so I feel like French names might work out as well, but we'll see about that later. Right now, I am already building the floorless coaster, which is hopefully going to be one of my new biggest money makers. At least that's what I was banking on when I was building this coaster. It also has a huge capacity, way too much for Parkitect, because you have 6 rows that seat 4 people, so that's an impressive 24 people per train. I'm also going to design this coaster in such a way that we can run 2 trains, so that's pretty good, which is just way too high of a capacity for what we need in Parkitect. Plus, unfortunately, this coaster is at the back of the park, from the entrance at least, and it's not too easy to reach through the pathworks, so it's not going to get too many visitors, I can already tell you that, which is a little bit unfortunate because it's the highest capacity coaster and one that would have earned very well if enough people rode this thing. But, you know, what can you do? I have noticed that sometimes it's better to build your rides with a slightly lower capacity in Parkitect, or at the very least, not worry about your capacity too much. And I don't know what it is about the fact that capacity in Parkitect is a little bit unrealistic. Maybe it's just the fact that you don't get that many guests compared to games like Planet Coaster or Roller Coaster Tycoon, which makes sense because the guests are quite large, and if you had as many guests as you would get in Roller Coaster Tycoon, they would just be clipping into each other the whole time. It would look weird, the paths would look overcrowded, so it's just something that would result in a very bad time. So given the art style and the skill of the game, I think it's totally understandable how many guests go to your theme park. But capacity is something that generally you don't have to worry about too much unless you're building a truly low capacity ride. But it is a little bit of a shame, I think, and a tiny bit of a shame that when you build high capacity rides like this floorless coaster and go out of your way to give them a good capacity with block breaks and the like, that your efforts aren't really rewarded with much higher income. But, you know, alas, it is what it is. Also, I haven't talked about the layout of this coaster at all, but I tried to make this as much of a terrain conforming coaster as possible. On the hillside over here, it's a little bit inspired by Hair Raiser at Ocean Park in Hong Kong, which is also very interestingly next to the ocean on a hill and following the terrain. Also has a very interesting curved drop that I couldn't really replicate on this coaster, but we get a slightly similar elongated layout, and the color scheme is also a little bit inspired by it. And then at the end, we have a helix that I made extra large, so we can fit this drop tower in there. And it's not the tallest drop tower. Also, it looks very funny on time-lapse, I just now realized. I think that's part of the reason that the queues don't tend to fill up that much in Parkitect, because if you look at the rates that they're going through that flat ride, wow, they are loading people so quickly, and it goes up super quickly. It's just high efficiency. Good job, guys. But yeah, I didn't make it too tall because otherwise it would just block the view of the station. And I don't know, that's just something that I always keep in mind when I'm doing observation towers and drop towers in this game. Because we have an isometric perspective and because a very long tower just looks kind of weird, I always end up making those things not super tall. So yeah, this thing is a little bit short. Yeah, what can you do about it? I think it looks better this way. I could have earned more money if I made it taller and gave it better stats, but I just think it works like this, so I'm keeping it like this. Also, I believe this model is based on the real-life Roto drop towers by Intamin. These things are some of the best drop towers, at least in terms of their drop, if you ask me. They really pull you down. You can feel the weight of that ring as it falls down the drop. I think they give a better dropping sensation than many other drop towers. Plus you have that rotating aspect that gives you a nice view of the area, wherever it is that you are. So yeah, definitely very good drop towers. Not the top of the line. I think there are some other drop towers which are which do some gimmick that makes them more interesting or are extra tall. These are never the tallest drop towers out there, but they're just good fun. They're always good. Now when it comes to drop towers, in my head, for some reason, the flat ride that's always been tied to it, or I don't know, it fits with the drop tower in every sense, is the top spin. And I think the reason for that is Mel's World in Roller Coaster Tycoon 1, where you had a drop tower that started underground and came out of the ground, and then you had a top spin right next to it. And for some reason, these rides just fit together so well, and that's one of the most memorable things that I remember from Roller Coaster Tycoon. Also, that whole concept of having a drop tower start underground and then launch into the air is so cool, and I don't think any park in real life has done this yet, and somebody needs to get on this. It's just awesome. Just imagine walking down a cave in the queue line and really getting that idea of getting deeper into the ground and then entering the drop tower and shooting into the sky. That would be absolutely amazing. I think there are some drop towers that kind of do that thing where you feel like you're inside somewhere and then the tower shoots you out of it. I know Atmosphere in Liseberg starts within a building, so that's pretty cool. It's a good Intamin drop tower as well. It's the typical Roto drop tower. But yeah, I think that kind of thing is just, it hasn't been done enough, especially with the SNS slingshot drop towers that shoot you into the sky instead of slowly lifting you up there. It just seemed like a missed opportunity. That said, I know in Glenwood Caverns there's the Haunted Mine Drop, which is a drop tower that drops you into the ground, which is also really fun and interesting as a concept. But you know, it's not quite the same. So anybody with money and influence in the theme park world, please build the kind of drop tower that we have in Mel's World in Roller Coaster Tycoon. That would be amazing. Also, you can, I was about to say, you can credit me for the idea, but you absolutely can't, because Roller Coaster Tycoon came up with it. By that I mean Chris Sawyer most likely came up with it, but it is pretty cool. Now over here, I wanted to build my next coaster because I wasn't making enough money yet. This is not because I am super greedy, because at this point I was making enough money to sustain my park and keep building stuff. But the goal of this scenario is to make $4,000 a month in ride ticket profit, which is huge. That's a lot of money. That's definitely part of the reason why this scenario is taking so long, because I just have to build so many rides to do this, which in a sense makes this one of the hardest scenarios that I've played. Although I'm never really struggling for money. I've almost gone bankrupt a few times, as you might have been able to notice. But it's never been a huge struggle. But definitely getting to that $4,000 a month income, which is decently doable if you hardly theme your rides and are mostly just plopping down intense coasters. You can get there with a few coasters. But on top of that, I'm trying to, of course, theme this park as much as possible and make it kind of realistic in the sense of the layout and everything. So things are taking a while. It's definitely quite difficult. So we need some coasters that are going to sufficiently contribute to our minimum of $4,000 of income every month. And what better coaster to do that than the hydraulically launched coaster, the Intamin Beast, which is just one of my favorite coasters to build. One of my favorite coasters in real life as well. They're just really fun. But launched coasters in general are always nice to build because you don't have to worry about the lift hill. And especially with this one, the layouts tend to be on the shorter side in real life as well, so you don't have to worry too much about putting all kinds of different elements into it. And this one has, I don't know, a layout that is basically unlike any real life Intamin hydraulically launched coaster. But I think it more or less works for what these things are. I'm struggling very much over here to give it some area to have a decent layout before it heads back to the station, and I figured this area on top of the staircase over here could work out for that purpose, but it's not very easy to fit the coaster layout in here. And because of all those challenges, we also have an interesting terrain conforming layout that starts off with an Immelman/dive loop. Who knows which one is which? I'm beyond caring at this point. And then into a large ejector airtime hill, which looks pretty fun, I have to say. It looks like it actually gives some good airtime. And then we have a station flyby, which is something that I've never seen on a coaster like this. Really, only wooden coasters do this, specifically Great Coasters International. But flybys are awesome. I think we need more station flybys in this world. I think my voice is really breaking down for talking for 40 minutes straight. But yeah, we have a station flyby, and after that, this kind of twisting layout of just a bunch of curves, which doesn't really do too much. I imagine you get some airtime on the twisted airtime hill near the end, so that's pretty good. But layout-wise, this is not the best launch coaster ever. But given, you know, the way that the terrain is a challenge and everything else, I'm limited on space. I think it does a decent bit of stuff that it's worth riding. Plus, it does remind me a little bit of Helix and Terran, especially at the latter section where it does all of those quick curves and quick transitions, which should probably actually be pretty fun. So yeah, I guess this is a coaster that I would like to ride in real life, which is one of the best ways to figure out how you should build a layout, honestly, in these kinds of games. Just build something that you would want to ride. And of course, it also has to look good, and it has to be affordable, and it has to work with the different restrictions of the park, and it has to make money. You know, these are all things that you have to keep in mind, but at the same time, making something that you would like to ride in real life, I think, is always part and a very important part of playing a theme park game like this. At least, I think that makes it a bit more interesting. Now, I've been afraid of roller coasters for most of my life, and I've also played theme park games for most of my life, so there is definitely just a huge part of me that appreciates doing this stuff for the creative side of things and for how things look and just the fun logistics of making it all work out and fit. But ever since I've started riding roller coasters myself a few years ago and started really loving them and becoming a thrill seeker in that sense, just imagining what kind of layouts would be fun to ride is also part of the fun. So that makes it even better. So that is the top section of the park over here. We also have a top scan flat ride because, you know, I figured why not? We don't have enough flat rides yet. Let's just add another one. And I'm starting to work out a pathway over here to basically the mountainside, where at some point in the future we're going to get another coaster. But I'm not quite yet going to reveal what that's going to be. And in the meantime, of course, there is still some rock work and foliage to fit into this area. So putting some rocks and some trees and some bushes in here. Now, my general rock work strategy with this area, as you might have been able to tell, is to hide some of the hard ridges of the hillside and make them rocky walls instead, which is pretty fun to do. It's pretty easy to do, and with the way that this hill is shaped, it also gives you some fun rocky sections kind of snaking and coiling through the hillside. And it also hides those hard edges of the terraforming in Parkitect and makes this hill, I feel, a little bit more natural looking and blends everything together a little bit. So that was fun to do, but also a little bit time consuming. So if you don't mind, I'm actually going to skip ahead here a little bit and move to the next ride that I'll be building, which I think is going to be very interesting. Though before I do that, I think it is worth showcasing for a little bit how I built the stations for these two coasters, because I didn't get to that yet. Now, these coasters are mostly about the thrills, they're not really about the theme. Also, they're higher up the hill, so I'm not as concerned about the theming here as I am at the beachfront, where I really want everything to look very nice. But at the same time, I want these station buildings to fit in with the rest of the park in terms of the detailing and the colors and everything. So I'm still taking some inspiration from some other areas. So for this station building, I've got the purple border, taking the purple from basically most of the beachfront area. Speaking of which, I decided to put some beach chairs and some parasols over here as well. So we get that beach look going with a little path leading down to the beach, just for, I don't know, imagining that people could go down here and actually enjoy it. But yeah, the station building is pretty simple, otherwise just some glass roof pieces, and in the middle a simple roof like that. It's actually a little bit inspired by the roof of Python in Efteling, which is, to me at least, that typical super simple, minimalistic thrill coaster station roof, but at the same time it just works. It's just a shape that looks nice for what it is. And for the station of the launched Intamin coaster over here, I decided to come up with something kind of similar, a little bit different, and still using the same pillar pieces and details that I use throughout the park. And I started using with basically the first building that I ever built at the start of the first time-lapse, right next to the water side. So that's something that just keeps inspiring all of the buildings in the rest of the park. But it helps make everything look coherent and like everything fits together, which is a combination of some thicker and some thinner pillar pieces to give these pillars a sense of detail, to make them look like they really have those Victorian decorations that you would typically see. And then in the middle we have a pointy roof, and on the sides we have some slightly less pointy roofs. So very similar shape in general, although I did decide to make the pointy roof stick out a bit more than the roofs on the side, and also add some awnings as extra decoration to prevent this thing from becoming a completely simple standard rectangular box. And now we get to an interesting coaster that hopefully is going to be the last coaster of this scenario, but I'm not entirely sure. The reason is that so far I've had some months where I make $2,500 to even close to $3,000, which is not near enough to $4,000 to reach the scenario. Also, I'm not sure if I'm going to hold those goals for a month or not. It's always a little bit of a surprise once we reach the goal if we're going to hold it for a while or not. So we'll have to see about that as well. But hopefully with this new coaster and lots of advertising, and I'm really putting my hopes on advertising, which I haven't done much so far because I've had to use all of my money to buy more land, because that stuff gets really expensive once you start buying lots of land. But yeah, once everything is bought and the rides are complete and I can spend all of my profits on advertising, I'm hoping that this is going to be enough to get me over that threshold. But first, I want to finish the map. I've filled in so much of this map at this point that the only place where I can still go is the top of the mountain. I decided to remove the snow that I put over here because as nice as it looked when the scenario was just completely empty, you know, I guess it gave a little bit of interesting contrast. It just doesn't really work with the scale of this mountain. It just looks a little bit unrealistic. Maybe I'll bring back the snow as a theming element, but I highly doubt it. I think I'm just going to theme this mine train to general rockwork and add some tunnels and stuff like that for sure, but not really make it too alpine because I feel like it's just too close to the rest of the park for that. Plus, I guess there's a little bit of a challenge here because usually mine trains are themed to a completely fake mountain, but in this case we do have an actual rocky hill over here. I'm just making a mine train on top of it and trying to theme that. So I'm gonna somehow have to fit in some rock work that actually does make this look a little bit fake, but at the same time it's built on a real hill, and all at the same time I'm also trying to put out of my mind the fact that this is a volcano, looking at the shape of this hill and the fact that we are on an island over here. And if you haven't noticed, it's very much a volcano-like because we have this peak over here with the crater in the middle, but we also have basically a caldera, a giant dead crater in the middle of this island. So if we want to get to lore, which I don't have, but if we want to get into lore, I guess you could very well say that this is an island where a very dangerous volcano sits that exploded at some point in the past, and where now a little baby volcano is growing yet again, kind of like Krakatoa or something like that, which makes the fact that I'm building a coaster over here also unrealistic, but let's forget about that because I think it would just look really cool. And maybe this whole island is artificial. Maybe that's the lore. I don't know what the Wuhu Island lore is in Wii Sports either, but it's definitely a volcano. And I'm definitely not really sure how good of an idea it was that they developed this whole society on this active volcano. But you know, that's just details that I don't want to worry about too much, and maybe I've already given it more thought than Nintendo have at this point. Now, when it comes to the layout of this coaster, which is also relevant, I would say, I'm just taking some general inspiration from mine trains like Big Thunder Mountain. Mostly Big Thunder Mountain, but you know, you always have the classics like Expedition Everest and Big Grizzly Expedition, and what else? The one in Phantasialand, which looks very different but has a really cool layout. So we just do some turns and some hills, and that's about it. I decided to add 2 lift hills to this thing and then try to make my way back to the station because that felt like the right balance of track to rockwork ratio. Not too much track and with enough space in between to add some rock work, but you can definitely see that the coaster is kind of snaking its way through the entire hill. And then down the hillside over here, I wanted to add a tunnel of sorts where it goes underneath the path and does some kind of interaction with that as well, so it's not just all the way out in the distance on top of the hill. And then later on, I'll figure out how to actually make it snake back to the station as well. Not entirely sure how that is going to work out, but sometimes you just have to stick to something that looks really cool and see how you're going to do the landing at a later stage, because it just the layout just goes over here. It just kind of works like that. It's something that You know, you can't plan everything. You just have to go with the flow of the layout and whatever your mind comes up with at any stage, and hope that at the end of the road you end up with something halfway decent. And over here also we get some interesting interaction where it goes underneath the bridge and then over the railroad, and also over a future path that I'm trying to keep in mind here. That's gonna have to go underneath the mine train. So that's that. And in the meantime, I was also trying to figure out how my railroad is going to go around the island, and this seemed like a good opportunity to start doing that. I wanted to make sure that I finished the coaster layout mostly before I started doing that, so I know where this rail line is going to be able to go. So we have it over here going through the back area of the park entrance, which is still weird. You know, people are just endlessly flowing out of that hotel. Come think of it, maybe I should add some kind of themed way that people are arriving to this resort, because right now there's not a place for cruise ships to dock, or ships in general. So that's something I still have to think about. But yeah, that is basically it for this section of time-lapse. Let's head back into the game for a second and see how it's going before I finish everything up. Alright, so here we are again. The park is looking pretty good. At this point, I find myself wanting to zoom in a bit more, because zooming out just makes me realize that everything is quite huge and it's taken so much work, but you really lose some of the detail, and really only once you zoom in, well, some details obviously actually disappear, like the shadows, as you can see, but generally there's just too much small stuff everywhere in this huge map. But I'm just gonna turn on the UI so we can check out some rides. So over here we have the new Main Street-ish area with this main boulevard leading up to the train station. I still want to add some extra theming to this ride, actually. I'm just keeping the fence like this at the moment. But other than that, this area is entirely finished and I'm pretty happy with it. Now, I do like to give all of the coasters a POV, but not entirely sure how much of a difference this one is going to make. But yeah, here we have the steeplechase, just making its rounds around the track. So quite simple, trying to keep this layout as realistic as possible, which unfortunately means that not much is happening here. There is a little bit of banking, as you can see, some kind of smooth-ish banking on some of these turns, which I think works pretty well for this coaster type, but I really wanted to make sure that I only banked on some of the curved sections so that we don't have any jarring transitions. And at the end there, it does get a little bit speedy. Unfortunately, it doesn't have brakes, so we really just have to be very careful with the momentum when building these coasters, or with our potential energy, I suppose. But it's pretty fun to build these things, actually. I was surprisingly entertained by it. Now let's move over to the floorless coaster. I also realize I haven't been giving my coasters names very often. I know I used to do that quite a lot, but I don't know. For some reason, it just doesn't feel too important compared to scenery and layout and all of that stuff. But yeah, here's our hair razor inspired floorless coaster. Doesn't really do anything interesting with its layout. It's definitely not the best coaster out here in the park, but I think the layout works for the setting, and it gives it some interesting interaction with the terrain and some of the other rides as well, so I'm pretty happy with that. And then we have this launch coaster, which I think is geared to launch. Yeah, some pretty good timing, some cool interaction between these two as well. So yeah, for this one as well, we have a pretty simple layout with some killer airtime, I think, on that hill. But other than that, it's just twisty Terran Helix-esque at the end here. Albeit not even quite as powerful, I think, looking at some of these transitions. But I think this little twisted airtime hill might still be quite good. And then we go back to the station. I think one key factor that I really like about terrain coasters is the fact that you can raise the station and have the layouts go down a little bit alongside the hillside, and then you don't have to enter the coaster or have to enter the station with as much speed left. So it doesn't feel like you waste a lot of speed. So even though this thing has a pretty strong layout and a pretty strong launch, at the end of the layout you definitely have lost most of your speed. So I don't know, that's just kind of satisfying to look at a coaster like that just slowly rolling into the station again. But yeah, those are the biggest points of interest, I suppose. Then we have the railroad kind of snaking its way through the park here. I've been using that word way too much in this episode. Also, I came up with a sort of a helix structure to make this thing go down, because the height difference between this over here and this station here is just way too big. And as weird as this station looks, I have been planning this station like this for a while. I just couldn't come up with anything else decent to do with this hill. Plus, I still needed some space to make this path wind its way back over here, because that felt like the right thing to do, because otherwise this would be a complete dead end, and we wouldn't want to have that. So I'm gonna try and figure out what kind of station I can turn this into, but I think it's going to be a pretty low-key one. But it might have some cool symmetry with the pathway over here and this building here. And also, as much as the train has a huge route that it takes around the island, we do have two stations, I think, kind of on opposite sides of both islands and on opposite sides of the water. So I think the station locations make sense and could realistically be used to get to the other side of the park-ish. And then the other side of the train is really this roundabout way that just takes you through the whole park. So down underneath this section over here, lots of interaction with the coaster here. It's probably going to interact a bit more with the mine train, because I'm trying to figure out how this layout is going to go. Part of the reason I already wanted to put in the train is to figure out how this is going to interact with the mine train, and I think the layout for the mine train is going to be easier to make over this train than the other way around. But yeah, other than that, it just goes all the way around the island and then comes back here. So that is basically it for all of the rides that I've been building so far. Now, my last job here is to figure out if this mine train, together with maybe some advertising and stuff, is enough to bring me up to a profit of 4,000. As you can see, I'm in the high 2,000s right now, but it's not quite there yet. So I'm very curious. If all else fails, I'm just gonna have to build another coaster, and that just means this episode is going to be that much longer. But we'll see. Anyway, I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's get back to building. So my main mission for this last part of the video was to finish the mine train, and we have this very typical mine train-esque part that's kind of more up the hill, and that's the first half of the ride, which is all cool, and it's a pretty mild ride with some rock work and stuff like that. But then I realized we get to this second section, and partly just to fill in the entire map and find space for this coaster to go, I'm more or less forced to go downhill a lot more, and I think this results in some fun interaction. Like over here at the top of the screen, you can see the coaster go through that tunnel and underneath the pathwork, and then it crosses underneath a bridge and has some interaction with the water over there and the train, which is all really cool. But it's pretty fast as it goes over there, and then we also have this enormous dip down to basically the sea, where it passes by the beach. And at that point I realized, after I'd finished the coaster and did some test runs, it reaches a max speed of 80 kilometers an hour, which is kind of nuts. For any miles people in watching this video, it's about 50 miles an hour. I had to look this thing up, but honestly my gut feeling told me that it was about 50 miles an hour, and turns out it's almost exactly right. But yeah, it's a lot for a mine train, so I'm not sure how thematically accurate this is going to be as a family coaster. I'm just gonna let it happen, because there are some mine trains in the world that do some weird things. I'm looking at you, Phantasialand. And I guess it's also really fun to have this coaster go through all of these tunnels and have this close to the ground action at very high speeds. You know, it doesn't do elements that are too intense, and definitely the faster elements are quite drawn out with very large curves and hills and the like, but it's still very intense. Also, it took a little bit of figuring out how this coaster could go to keep it as close to the ground as possible, because this latter section over here, I'm not going to make it entirely like a real-life mine train would and stick it on the ground at all times, but I wanted to keep it as close to the ground at all points in the layout. But obviously every now and then you want your layouts to have some hills and to have higher points and lower points, etc. So mostly I'm just making use of the hillside and sticking as closely to that as possible, but using tunnels for some of the lower dips to make sure that the taller sections don't stick out too much. So we don't have huge messes of supports anywhere, which is useful because it means that I won't have to work too much with a lot of intricate rock work to hide away some of the weird terrain bits. Because my strategy for this coaster to make it really feel like a mine train and give it that rockwork theming was to not give the entire coaster rockwork theming. I think that would have been way too expensive and too much effort in a video that's already becoming pretty lengthy. But to try and blend the rockwork as much as possible with the in-game terrain, especially some of the parts where the terrain has those little cliff sections, because they look a little bit strange if they're paired with rockwork sometimes. So I'm trying to blend them a little bit, but not place rocks absolutely everywhere. One exception was that cliffside next to the railway tracks over there, because I thought it would be really cool to just add a bunch of vertical looking rocks to hide that cliff face as much as possible. The same kind of goes for this bridge over here where the coaster dips underneath the path. I think it just looks better to hide it as much as possible. But another trick that I use to try and blend in those rocks a little bit more with the terrain is to paint the terrain grey, or at least use what I believe is intended as a concrete texture in the game to make the surface terrain grey, but it automatically also makes the cliff texture grey, which is a handy tip if you ever want to give a cliff texture a different color than what's associated with the ground texture, because normally if you have a grassy ground texture it automatically makes the cliffs brown, but as soon as you make even one very small part of that grid piece another color, it's going to change the entire cliff structure or cliff texture of that tile to another texture. So just by placing one little bit of gray concrete, you can make the entire cliff of that grassy piece gray as well, and it really helps to blend it in with the rock work. And I'm not going to do that all over the island, but definitely around the mine train here and wherever I'm trying to blend these rocks with some cliffs. It's a huge help, and it works very well with a sandy texture as well if you want to make some sandstone cliffs or something like that. So that's a pretty fun thing to try. Also, I'm going to stick to some sort of tree line idea and only place trees up to a certain height, which means that for most of the upper part of the layout, this mine train is not going to have any trees, barely any bushes, and it's mostly just going to be grey rocks everywhere. But then as soon as you get to a lower level, and as soon as we get to the paths and everything, I'm just going to put trees everywhere. Another thing that I think was worth pointing out is that I made this rock work by basically taking a few rock pieces and making them really big and sinking most of them into the ground so that you get this very large rocky texture everywhere and you don't end up with rock work that looks like it's made up of many small rocks. Because with large structures like this, I think it's best to just stick with a few very large rocks, which is fun and fine because it means that it doesn't take too much work to make the rock work, and I think it looks pretty good. But it does mean that every single rock you place costs you hundreds of dollars in in-game money, which means that you very quickly start running out of money. And I guess it makes sense because a huge rock is much more expensive than a small rock. And it's great that things actually scale in terms of price as well, since you can scale all the objects in the game. But since most of the rocks are hidden underground and I'm mostly just using the tops of those gigantic rock pieces to make an interesting texture, it just means that things get really expensive. So it's good that at this point I was making lots of money from my ride admissions, because otherwise this whole dream would have become completely unaffordable. But it is something that's worth pointing out, and I think it's a good reason to keep your rockwork ambitions to the last section of your scenario when you already have a bunch of rides and your park is very well filled out, because usually only at that point can you really afford giant rockwork structures, which is something to keep in mind in the game. Some things are very expensive and some things are cheaper than you'd expect. Terraforming, for instance, is relatively cheap, and especially if you only change a few small things or make a few small hills, you don't pay that much for it. In fact, you can generally make a hill for less money than you can make a giant rock for. Now, moving on, I wanted to theme this area around the coaster a little bit more. I figured it would make sense to make this back half of the park, and I say half, but it's really just a small corner of the park, but at least make this section in the back a little bit more rustic, so more stone, dark stone textures, a lot more wooden textures, more rustic colors, and not so much the super bright colors of everything in the front of the park. Lots of trees as well. So it's kind of different in feel to the front of the park, which I think also matches the fact that we're on the hillside. We don't have a view of the ocean or the beaches. We just have a small river, lots of rock work, and lots of foresty area. So I think it goes better with the overall vibe of the back half of the park. And part of that for me was also making a covered bridge. This is already the second covered bridge in this scenario, I realized, but making these things is just too much fun, and it's really such a typical element of any alpine area, I feel like. So I figured that was a worthwhile touch to add in. And then one of the last buildings of this park is going to have to be the station for the mine train. And to be completely honest, I didn't really think about this thing too much. Just like the bridge in front of it, I'm going to stick to a very simple rustic style, something that I've done in Parkitect many times before. So I really didn't want to give it too much thought. In fact, it's mostly kind of going to be hidden among the trees and just be a very generic station building. But I figured it would sell the theme of the mine train best and just work for this area of the park. We don't need that fancy Victorian white decorated architecture everywhere. I think in a sense this building is still inspired by the same era as the other buildings in the park. Just a little bit less expensive and a little bit less extravagant and a bit more in the outback, if you will. Speaking of which, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to go less heavy on the details. In fact, looking back at this scenario, maybe I've gone too far in some of the details, especially in the front section of the park. I think it was really fun, but it's definitely not necessary to make something nice looking. I think overall composition and use of colors is much more important than how many details you put into a certain build. So I would rather focus on things like that. But it is always fun to work on details, so definitely won't stop myself from doing that. But I think detailing is not even the most important part of what makes a park looks good. Composition and colors are 80% of the work at least, and everything else is just an added bonus to me. And I think composition and colors accounts for everything, including where your coasters are going, how your paths are laid out, how your buildings are laid out, how large they are, how much rock work you have everywhere, what kind of color the rock work has and how it fits with the terrain, what kind of trees you're using, how large your trees are, the color of your trees. And I think especially in Parkitect, where you can change the scale of so many items and you can change the colors of all your trees, I think these are the biggest parts in what makes park work. And detailing is really just something that you notice the more you look at a park, and that makes it more interesting to look at for longer, but to make something interesting to look at first glance and make it work from the start. And really the foundation of a good looking park, I think, it bears no repeating. But just to say, it doesn't necessarily mean that I like this area less. In fact, I think it works pretty well with the trees and the large rock work and the way that we have the water interacting with the bridge and the coaster and everything. It's just not as time consuming as some of the other parts of the park, which have a lot more detail. Also, something that you might have noticed at the top of my screen is that in fact we do have to hold the scenario goals for 3 months in a row, which is quite a challenge, as you might have noticed. I found myself reaching the goals for 2 months consecutively a few times, and I think it's actually on my third try that I finally managed to keep it for 3 months. Usually what would happen is that I would be almost at the necessary $4,000 a month of ride admission income, or ride profit even, because your admissions, you still have to deduct the costs of your rides, monthly cost from that, and then you get to your profit, and you have to have $4,000 of profit every month. But yeah, usually every month I found myself almost having $4,000 of profit, but then the third month this would happen, like a lightning storm would happen, or one of the major coasters would break down, or people would just leave the park, or my advertisement campaign would run out and people would start leaving the park and no new people would enter, all kinds of stuff like that. Anyway, it's actually more difficult to hold these goals for 3 months, I found, than to quickly tick them for a month. And yeah, your profits in 1 month aren't necessarily a guarantee that you're gonna keep seeing those profits in the next few months. So trying to hold them steady was definitely a big challenge. And looking back at this scenario, I think also the reason why this turned out to be such a long video, because getting $4,000 of profit a month while also trying to make a park that's not focused on roller coasters but rather focused on this town look and the beachfront, maybe wasn't the very best combination. That said, there was an unexpected hero in this story, and that's the train line. I had no idea that this thing would even make money at all. So imagine my shock when I realized that this turned out to be the most profitable ride in the whole park. And it's the last ride I built, and I mostly just built it because I thought it would be a cool thing to add as a scenery element and to have this thing go around the park. Technically it's not the last ride I built because I kept working on it throughout the park, but you know, it's the last ride I opened. But as soon as I did, I noticed that it made a bigger profit than all of my roller coasters. So honestly, the train is the MVP of this scenario, and I wouldn't have reached the goals of this scenario without that train opening and becoming as popular as it is. So as much as I expected to have to bank off of my coasters and use those as my primary form of income, which they are because there are more coasters than the single train that there is in this scenario, the train is undoubtedly the reason that I managed to finish the scenario. And if it wasn't for that train, I honestly don't know what else I could have done to make the scenario work without trying to jam extra coasters or rides into places where I wasn't thinking of placing them. So with all that said, I'm just building one little building here at the end to finish off this corner of the park. And now let's take a look at how the park looks in the end and how I managed to reach the goals. Alright, just a little bit more. And there we go. So that's that. That was a very long one. And honestly, I'm not completely done because I still want to showcase this coaster. Just realized that we just missed the boat on one of our last trains, finally finishing that first long lift hill. So here we go. Fun fact about block sections and stuff, I decided to give this one a wait of, what was it, 35 seconds at least, 45 seconds at most, and it's basically the perfect combination to make sure that you never have a train waiting on any of the lift hills. But at the same time we can run 3 trains on this thing, so in that sense it's a pretty realistic mine train, I suppose. God, I actually forgot that this game actually makes all of the terrain transparent when a coaster goes through the tunnel. That's very handy. Also, I don't know what's up with that Z-finding over there, but you guys never noticed that. Also, these people are in for a lot of rain, but you know, it is what it is. So after that first and pretty mild, I'd say, first half of the ride, we hit a short second lift hill, because this is a mine train after all. We need a bunch of lift hills in these things. We also got a really cool timing on the interaction between these trains, so that was a fun touch. Honestly, I would say that was that was not accidental, but it totally was. And then we hit this almost max speed of almost 80 kilometers an hour. And we get some really good airtime on there, I think. And then we hit the max speed of almost 80 kilometers an hour. Another great airtime moment over here. This might actually be the ride with the best airtime in the park, honestly. And then a bunch of tunnels down here to make its way back to the station. But also, as you can see, the fact that it hits that very high speed means that by the time we get back to the station, we don't have to brake too much. So it doesn't feel like there's a lot of wasted kinetic energy over there. So all things considered, I'm pretty happy with this coaster, and yeah, I think it's not the most heavily themed mine train or anything like that, but I was trying to strike a balance between the so-called realistic rockwork of the mountain that we have here and just the natural terrain, but at the same time the look of the fake rockwork in a mine train coaster and how those things are usually themed. And then of course we have the train, which has different vehicles with different colors. Fun fact for people who might not know this kind of stuff, but you can color every single vehicle of any ride individually. So I can color this thing, I can color this thing. Obviously we now lost the cool color schemes that these things had, so I'm gonna try and bring it back to something along the lines of what it was. But yeah, I decided to give a bunch of trains different colors. There are still a couple with the same color scheme, but yeah, we just have a bunch of different types of trains going around this ride. So that was also pretty fun. But yeah, most of this ride is honestly pretty boring because you don't really see anything. Although I guess the fact that it's next to the ocean and you do have a cool view from there would make it interesting. But I think the most interesting bits of this train are whenever we go through an area that has a bunch of rides that it interacts with. And maybe, if you're very lucky, you can see one of these coasters and one of the trains, like over here. And you have such a cool view of that train going through the corkscrew. That's the kind of thing I think dreams are made out of. And that's why you want to have different tracks of different rides interact with each other, just so every now and then the timing will just be right that you can have some interaction with between the vehicles. So that's a fun part of that, I think. Let's see if we can follow another train for this other section of the ride over here. Oh, that's the same train. Like over here. This one has some interesting interaction over here with the top scan. And then it goes through a tunnel here, which is, I believe, a decently lengthy tunnel. It was a bit of a puzzle figuring how this was going to fit in with the ride dropping down here. But in the end, I think it works pretty well. And then you can also see the mine train over here, and maybe even have a cool view of the monorail coaster above your head. And finally, we have this helix over here, where it actually goes pretty quick. It's kind of dangerous. Looks like you might actually hit some laterals on that one. But yeah, that's how the train works in this game. I also just realized that this monorail coaster is way too popular for its own good. Maybe should have added some block breaks there, but you know, it's too short for that. But yeah, that is basically it for all of the rides in this park. So I hope you guys got a good overview of what's available in the park. But just one last trip to every corner. We have the main first area over here with the boulevard, with a few flat rides and the classic lighthouse that's been here since the beginning. And then moving over to this section, we have the largest part of the town, well, the quote-unquote town, I would say. You might also notice that the game is starting to lag a little bit, which is honestly just the case. I think I'm definitely pushing the capabilities of the game engine at this point. But then from this large town area, we move to the monorail coasters, which are just always fun to look at as well, even though they're not too interesting as a coaster type. I think it is fun when you have these things dueling, and it just makes for a cute little area with a bunch of I don't know, just it's just fun to look at these things. But I guess that goes for many coasters going around. And then we get to this crazy mess of tangled track and flat rides everywhere, where even these coasters have some interesting interaction every now and then. It's just too much fun to look at stuff like this. I swear it's not just with theme park rides. I'm so hyped when you're driving on a highway and there's a train above you that you cross underneath at the exact right time. It's just always fun. But theme parks are the kind of setting where you can perfectly set things up to create these experiences in a controlled environment, you know? So that's part of the fun of games like these. And just watching things go around is really important as well. I think any themed area is improved by having some form of kinetic energy, making it come to life a little bit more. And I think that's just the fun part of watching coaster trains and little trains go around a park. Speaking of which, these trains do have comically short trains because they consist of only one vehicle basically. But I figured that would be worth it because we also have very short queue lines, and yeah, it just means we get to see lots of little trains go around the park. So honestly, I just think it's a huge plus anyway. But yeah, the last part of this park is of course the kind of rustic wooded setting over here. But even that, I think, doesn't stand too much in contrast to the rest of the park. And what I'm especially happy with is looking back at this whole build. The castle in the middle, which we started everything off with and which we can't remove or add anything to because it's mostly outside of park boundaries, I think it fits in with the look of the overall park now, and it makes for a fitting centerpiece, literally and figuratively. And yeah, I'd consider it a successful scenario, not just in the goals, but also how everything ended up as. So let's quit this thing and see what map we get from this. So obviously this is our trophy. That makes sense. And I just noticed the Happy Co Harbor ship over there. That's a nice touch. Oh, wait, can I? Okay, maybe not doing the animation, who knows. Anyway, our next scenario is, Celeste Mountain. That's gonna be good. Well, I guess I'll see you guys next time. I hope you enjoyed this video, and take care. Bye-bye.